Hello and welcome to our video, our discussion on food and drink in Roman London. We are the Guildhall Galleries team for the City of London Corporation, and we run the City of London Police Museum and the Billingsgate Roman House and Baths. I'm Howard Benj, how do you do? And I'm joined by Kim Biddulph.
Hello.
And Andrew Lane.
Hello.
Andrew also works at the London Roman Amphitheatre. And all of us, we are archaeologists. We've all started out digging and studying archaeology. This video is part of the Our City Together programme, which is run by the City of London Corporation. And the theme this month, July, is food and drink, which is why we're talking about food and drink in Roman London. So let's get started. First of all, before we get on to food and drink, let's just have a quick look at Roman London. And here's a modern day map of London, but you can see on that map there's a purple line giving us a clue a bit about what Londinium was. Andrew, do you want to say a few words about Londinium?
Oh, yes. The purple line marks where the walls for the Roman city would have gone around the outside. So it gives us some idea of the scale of Londinium, about a mile across and about a mile deep. We also have, if you look very carefully along the blue line, the River Thames, you'll see that there's a dotted line going across, and that marks the point where the bridge was built, linking the north part of Londinium to the south part of Londinium. So Londinium, initially founded as a trading settlement, very quickly grows in importance, and we think that it probably becomes the capital of Roman London towards the end of the 1st century, perhaps the start of the 2nd century AD. And it is by far the largest city in the province of Britannia. It's always very difficult to estimate populations, but archaeologists tend to think that the population of Roman London at its height would have been between perhaps 20 and 30,000 people. So a huge city, a bustling city, lots of buildings, lots of people from around the Roman world. And of course, as with any Roman city, there would have been lots of important buildings, some of which we've talked about in previous talks. But most important possibly today would be the Roman Forum being the marketplace where the population of Londinium would have gone to buy some of their provisions.
And that's the slightly smaller purple square, isn't it, with the just up from the bridge of the Forum.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and not far away either, we've got to mention it while we're here, is the amphitheatre. So you go just slightly northwest, there's the amphitheatre as well. But quite a densely packed city with all those connections, the River Thames leading out to the rest of the empire through boats, and major roads go linking up to the rest of Britain as well. So quite the metropolis then.
And can I just quickly mention Billingsgate Bathhouse as well, my favourite site, down by the bridge and just to the east of that, where it says Bathhouse, that's Billingsgate Bathhouse.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I think important to mention here, the bathhouse, where it says bathhouse, there's the wall going along. That was actually the edge of the River Thames, wasn't it? So the Thames was much wider then, wasn't it?
Yeah. And very much for trading. Yeah. It was a bustling port for most of the time that Londinium was inhabited.
Yeah. So in fact we had the Roman warehouses all along the wharf there leading up to the bridge. So yeah, it was very much a place for imports and exports as well. Let's look at some of the evidence though. We've talked about buildings, and we always do tend to focus on buildings and structures and infrastructure and armies and legions and politics when we talk about the Roman Empire and Rome itself. But let's look at some of what we call, us archaeologists call, small finds, because whenever you start digging in Londinium, you will find eventually, going down far enough, you'll find Roman material. And there's plenty of it in the Museum of London. You can go visit when it finally opens its doors, hopefully very soon. But these pictures are of images, watercolours from a catalogue. It's the Catalogue of Antiquities by John Walker Bailey. It's in Guildhall Library, although the actual catalogue itself is owned by the Watchville Company of Ironmongers. Interesting though, because John Walker Bailey was an ironmonger, but also a very successful businessman in the city with a real interest in antiquity and the Roman period. And what he would do, along with other people of his time, we're talking about the mid 19th century, he would actually pay labourers and builders money when they brought him along items that they discovered when they were building, huge buildings, houses, whatever, warehouses in the city of London in the 19th century. So he had a huge collection of artefacts which took over the whole wing of his house. And this catalogue is beautifully illustrated with these watercolors. All the items went to the Museum of London, so that's where these items are now. But it just gives us a flavour of what sort of things we discover that relates to everyday life, including food and drink in Roman London. This is, in fact, a flagon, is it not, Kim?
Yeah, so this is like a pouring jug for drinks, things like wine, which was obviously very popular. And you find these a lot, as well as but you've got some other images from John Walker Bailey, haven't you?
Yes, yeah, in fact, the next one, this is quite an everyday, well, it's standard object. It's not particularly nice looking. This is the nice stuff. It's called Samian ware, and this probably produced in Gaul. It's always got this bright red terracotta color to it, and often with patterns and pictures around the outside. It was quite nice stuff, but it was also everyday objects that people would use to eat and drink. But go on, Kim.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's got this beautiful orange slip over it, which kind of makes it very hardy. And obviously they were fired in they were made in kind of an industrial way, so that they were made in huge quantities, all to the same standard. So they were kind of very high quality, but you knew that every single piece of Samian would be the same, and that was what made it so popular, I think. But yeah, as you say, made in there were kind of three main centres in Gaul where it was made, but some Gaulish potters came to Britain and made some Samian as well, although there were also imitations of Samian being made in Britain, because it was just so lovely and popular. It's like the Le Creuset of Roman Britain, Roman Empire.
Also made in Gaul.
Yes.
Andrew.
And archaeologists really like it because you get plain pieces of Samian ware, but you also get decorated pieces of Samian ware. And the decorated pieces, they're really interesting because we get lots of different types, lots of different decorated types. And it's a great dating material for archaeologists because you get different patterns at different times. So archaeologists get quite excited sometimes when they find Samian ware, particularly if it's decorated Samian ware.
And you can tell we're archaeologists because we've gone right off the subject of food and drink here and talking about pottery in itself. We're not geeky at all. Let's move on to what actually I really like. This is some beautiful glass. And if you look at the top of that page, again from John Walker Bailey's catalogue, it's beautifully illustrated and painted, and it really shows the sort of the quality of this glass. It's a bowl. It's those ridged round things at the top are they're bowls, and in fact, I'm lucky enough to have a photograph of one that we put together in an exhibition in the Guildhall Library a few years ago. That item, that glass bowl, is actually it's not one of those in the catalogue we see. They were quite common, but this one is from the Museum of London, and there it is next to those catalogues of John Walker Bailey. And please ignore that stool in the background. This is a photograph taken whilst we were putting the exhibition together. So the case is up, and I didn't think about that stool. I see it now. But really beautiful pieces. Initially, early on in Londinium's life, so in the first century, initially it was imported from other parts of the empire, but in London, around the Moorgate area, there were quite a few glass production centres. So these materials and these objects would have been produced by the heyday of Roman London for sure. Now that gives us an idea of the objects we find, but we do also find lots of other fascinating items that give us a lot of information that you might just disregard at first. Kim, would you like to explain?
Yeah, so this is a picture that I took at an exhibition at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Of it was the Pompeian food exhibition. But what I loved was these little tiny seeds, which when they survive, often they're carbonized, so they've been dropped in a fire and they've been partially burned, but that helps them survive for a long time. And if they're also found in really wet places, then they tend to survive quite well. Kind of muddy places. So here you can see these are they're from Britain rather than Pompeii. On the left, you can see the three little dishes, and it's got number 8 next to it. Those are olive pips, lentils, and pomegranate seeds. They were all found from number 1 poultry, so that's the building that looks like it's made out of Lego that fronts onto Bank Junction. So that's quite interesting to find those really quite exotic foods there. Obviously, the Romans brought these in. Number 9, the dish number 9, is peppercorns, and these were found at 41 Eastcheap. These obviously peppercorns come from India originally, and the Roman Empire, being so big, was trading to the east and bringing some of these spices back, which is amazing. Number 10, can you see the broken pot? And in the bottom of the pot, there's mustard seeds, dill seeds, and coriander seeds. So again, mustard probably would have been around in Britain beforehand, but coriander would be a new thing brought from the Mediterranean. However, not everything that they brought was quite so lovely. In dish 11, those are actually cockroach eggs. They were imported in grain. That was found at the Bloomberg site, which is on the side of the Walbrook, so a very muddy site, and they've survived very well. So yeah, I'm afraid also the Romans introduced cockroaches. And in 19, that's carbonized grain. So that's the kind of thing that the Romans wanted when they came to Britain, because Britannia grew lots of wheat and barley, lots of grain. It was a great climate for it, and the Romans could then control that and export that back to other areas of the empire where they needed it, particularly for the army. And then on the right, you've got some things from other areas in Britain. So we've got, oh no, actually, hang on. Some of these are, actually, they're from Silchester on the right. The ones on the left, by the way, they were all carbonized in AD 60 or 61 when Boudicca attacked London. But on the right, these things are from a place called Silchester, which is out towards Reading or just beyond Reading from London, and was also a really big city, very important city in the Roman period. So you've got fish bones, which include eel, trout, and flatfish vertebrae in dish 12. You've got some oyster shells that you can just see, I think, on the left. Yeah, and edible snails, of course, they were introduced. You've also got some apple skin and apple seeds, 15 and 16, which is very much a British food that was around before the Romans. 17 is cherry and plum stones, which again were around before the Romans, but 18 are grape pips, and obviously grapes were introduced by the Romans. And at 19, there are peas, 20 lentils, and 21 fig seeds as well, figs being introduced. So it's quite an amazing range of foods that suddenly gets brought into Britain, and they become very popular, understandably, because they're all delicious.
Absolutely, and that really offers a good range of the food on offer for everyday food, doesn't it? Lentils, grain, figs. We all hear a lot about edible dormice and the garum, of course, the stinky fish sauce. But the everyday sort of food was standard food, bread, porridge, that sort of thing. Let's have a quickly move on though, because of course people ate meat as well. Evidence for food processing, as us archaeologists like to call it. Other people might call it cooking. So yeah. Kim, do you want to talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, so these are some pictures of animal bones that have been processed. They're not necessarily Roman, I'm afraid, but this was the best picture I could find. These are to be found just littering the foreshore when the Thames, the tide goes out, and you can see the sides of the river exposed. And I went down with the Thames Explorer Trust for a little walk and found these, but obviously left them there because you have to have a license from the Port of London Authority to take anything away. But some of the animal bone down there will be Roman, some of it will be later. And obviously we get a lot of animal bone surviving, and so it can tell us quite a lot about what people were eating. And in Britain, before the Romans arrived, mostly people were eating sheep and goats, or sheep goats. We can't really tell the difference between sheep and goat bones, so we call them sheep goats. Although there was a bit of cattle around as well. And the Roman diet is a lot more pig focused, but it doesn't actually seem to have made much of a difference on Britannia, which carried on eating similar stuff, actually, according to some studies. So yeah, there's quite a lot of animal bone being brought in to London from the provinces as well, from the hinterland, and then processed here.
Great. Andrew, you were...
Yeah, I was just going to mention that, one of the things they found in the amphitheatre excavations were lots of animal bones. And we think those animal bones would have been deposited after the amphitheatre fell into disuse. So it's waste material, and they're just using the amphitheatre as a dumping ground. The archaeologists have looked at those bones, and there's a lot of them. And they think that they may have come from, or at least some of them came from, an abattoir. So yeah, we've got lots of the bones, lots of the animals that Kim's been talking about. So cattle, sheep, goats, pig, horse. They found dog. They also found small quantities of red deer, chicken, duck, and fish bones as well. So fresh and seawater fish. So again, giving some sort of indication of the different meats that were being eaten in Londinium.
Yeah, and a varied diet.
And it's interesting in the Iron Age, the people aren't eating a lot of fish at all, but that is definitely something that gets introduced by the Romans and starts to become more popular, especially in the urban centres. We've got a fish slide, haven't we?
Yes, a slide of mosaic showing actual fishing. And when in my memories of excavating a Roman site at Stanwick in Northamptonshire many decades ago, one memory that sticks in my mind is the middens, the stacks, these piles of oyster shells. It was the common food. And I was just gobsmacked to see these middens, just shell after shell after. It's like a whole mound of shells. It's difficult to describe it. But fish, but very much part of the diet. Andrew.
And I think it's quite interesting as well, because we think that, yes, in the Iron Age they would have eaten fish, but there's an intensification of the production of fish during the Roman period. So we have fish farms, for example, for the first time. So yeah, they're adapting the food sources and intensifying it.
Yeah, you do find a lot of, fish bones don't survive that well. Usually it's the vertebrae that you find, the bones in the spine. And as you say, Howard, they're oyster shells, and they would have been grown in the Thames estuary and then sent up to London, but were very, very popular and quite cheap, it seems, because there's so many of them. There's another way that you can look at this consumption of fish as well, not just through the actual remains of the food items, but also through the bones of the Londoners. So there are some huge cemeteries out around the outside of Londinium, because people couldn't be buried inside the walls. And if you look at those bones, you can do a test called stable isotope analysis. This means that you're looking at the ratio of different isotopes of elements in the bones, and that can tell you about what people were eating, because depending on what you eat, it gives you a different chemical signature to your bone. This study was done by Rebecca Redfern at the Museum of London and a team around her, and it's really, really interesting. They looked at the ribs of 107 individuals, 77 children and 30 adults, to look at particularly comparing childhood diet to adult diet. And they were looking at carbon and nitrogen isotopes in the bones. What they found was that young people, children, tended to eat freshwater fish, and adults tended to have a much larger amount of seawater fish. And they kind of concluded that the freshwater fish was really cheap and plentiful, and is good enough for the kids. But if you're going to eat marine fish that were brought in from elsewhere, then that was going to be reserved for the important adults. So I think that's really, really interesting. But they also found that actually it was only a small part of the diet that was also terrestrial plants and animals, which you can also check with this chemical test. So yeah, I thought that was a really interesting study. And that's focused on London's population. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's crack on. Yeah, I mean, this is a photograph of amphora from the British Museum. It's actually Iron Age. This is interesting, isn't it? It's a late Iron Age burial at Welwyn. But it's basically towards the end of the Iron Age, pre-Roman invasion. People across the southeast were importing wine and other foodstuffs from the empire, were they not? Andrew, do you want to have a quick talk about this?
Yeah, so for the elite at least, yeah, some of the foodstuffs were already available in the pre-Roman period, in the Iron Age, particularly the wine, which was very much a high status product. So it was a way for the British elite to show off, to have their banquets in a very Roman fashion. So another of the imported foodstuffs which are coming from around the empire. And we have the amphoras, the large vessels at the back, which would have been used for transporting the wine. And then we have some of the other vessels that you would have used for decanting the wine into. And right at the front, it's not very clear in this photograph, but I think there's a silver cup, which would have been used by a member of the elite for drinking the wine. So a whole range of different wine-related items.
Brilliant. Yeah, well, let's move on, because let's start talking about the kind of foods in sort of context of the places as well. I know this is Herculaneum. Bear with us for a moment. But most people lived in Londinium would have lived in single-roomed buildings, or perhaps a building, a house. Your flat might have had a few rooms to it. But there wasn't really the dining areas and the kitchen areas that we have in our flats and houses today. So a lot of the food was actually cooked away from the home, the domus, and for most people it would have been that standard food, everyday kind of food. So the cereals, the emmer, for example, barley as well, bread, porridge. For poorer people, they would have had some meat, but maybe the cheaper cuts of meat, the offal and so on. Fish we've been talking about, and lots of figs. I've mentioned figs, but as you more wealthy you are, there's a whole spectrum of food on offer. So if you're more wealthy, you might have had, more expensive cuts of meat and so on, going right up to the luxury food, which is quite often what we talk about in literature and having a bit of fun with, about those crazy foods that some of the Romans ate in their banquets. But every day, sort of living in the city, you would have gone out into the city to these places that sold street food. You would have bought your food. You might have taken it home, might have been like a takeaway. You might have eaten it on the street, wherever it was. You might have bought for your whole family and taken it back. So they had a whole sort of, you could have eaten it in all sorts of ways. This, though, is a fantastic example from Herculaneum, a photograph taken by Andrew Lane. So Andrew, you were there. You want to explain it a bit more?
I just wanted to include this because it's one of my favourite pictures, and it brings back happy memories of working there many years ago. And I know that the type of building that we've got here is probably slightly different to the type that you would have had in Londinium, but I just wanted to show this because it gives an idea of just how crowded some of the streets were. So if we look at the picture, and we've got lots of entrances, and from the left, the second entrance is into a big villa, which was just off the street, but all of those other entrances belong to shops. So we can imagine that in Roman London, it would have been exactly the same. There would have been, we've already mentioned the Roman Forum, this big square building at the centre of London where you would have gone to perhaps buy things, but there also would have been lots and lots of shops lining the streets. And it would have been very busy. And if we can just move on to the next slide. Not only do we have all these shops, but we also have some of the things that, are familiar to us today. So this is a wonderful example of advertising. So outside the shops, you might have a street sign, or otherwise you might have a sign painted onto the wall. And this painting shows, flagons, and it's a shop that was selling different types of wine, and it gives you the different qualities of wine that you could buy from this shop. So not so very different to, lots of the streets that you might find in London today. Lots of shops, lots of signs, lots of things trying to draw you into them. So it would have been a very busy sort of place. And
the thermopolium, something else from Herculaneum.
Haha, there we go. So we have the thermopolium, so we have the shops, and then we have thermopolium, which are a particular type of shop that would have sold hot food probably and drink. And this image here shows a typical thermopolium from Pompeii or from Herculaneum. And we have a bar, which is like the counter to the shop. And you might just be able to see that we've got some circular holes in the top of the counter, and that's where they would have put some really large amphora, not the same shape as the ones we've seen already, but slightly rounder. They would have been built into the bar itself, and we think that they would have been used for probably storing dried food. So perhaps grain, perhaps figs, perhaps other types of fruit, those sorts of things. Once upon a time, archaeologists used to think that they were used for storing hot food in, but I think now lots of archaeologists are thinking, actually, that's not very hygienic. If you've got hot food stored in these big dolia, they're called, amphora, sunk into the counter, then it would be very difficult to actually get to the bottom of those, because they're huge, to try and clean them out. So we think it's probably more likely that they was used to store dried fruit. And these thermopolia, they come in all different forms. So some of them are quite small, and when they've excavated the shops themselves, they've only been big enough to actually have the counter. So we think that some of them you would have just gone, you would have brought your food, perhaps your hot food, and taken it away onto the street or somewhere else. But other thermopolium are larger. Some of them have room for people to sit, and there's some at Pompeii which even have gardens behind them. So yeah, you get different types of thermopolium. So some for you to sit and eat, others for you to quickly take away your food. And just to give you some idea of the number of these sorts of premises that you would find, in Pompeii, which is only partially excavated, of course, they've worked out there's about 600 tabernae or shops which have been excavated or can be identified. And of those, about 160 were equipped to sell food and drink. So we're talking about places with lots and lots of shops, and Pompeii would be far smaller than Roman London at its prime. So lots of shops.
And it sounds quite civilized, the thermopolium. I quite like the sound of it. But let's go on to the next one, because of course there was the amphitheatre, which attracted huge numbers of crowds. They'd all want to entertain, of course, but they'd all want eating as well, wouldn't they? They'd need to eat, wouldn't they, Andrew?
Well, we know that, the Romans are never one to miss an opportunity. If you had the games happening and you had possibly up to 10,500 people seated in the amphitheatre, those people, they could be there for the whole day because the games tended to go on for the day. One of the things they might well want is something to eat and something to drink. So if they hadn't already brought something from the forum or from one of the shops lining the streets, then we think almost certainly there would have been markets around the amphitheatre that, again, would have sold all sorts of goods, including food and drink.
And dormice?
Oh, dormice to the wealthy, possibly, yes.
Oh, okay. And moving on, to give an example of actually this food. Kim, you have actually cooked some, well, I'm going to say Roman food, but you followed the recipes, haven't you, to produce some Roman food?
Yeah, so these are called globi, because they're round, presumably. and it's from a book by Cato, a classical writer on agriculture, De Agricultura, and he says pastry balls should be made like this: mix cheese with spelt flour in the same way. I don't know in the same way as what, but that obviously is an extract from something else. From this, you can make as many pastry balls as you like. Put some fat in a bronze pot. Cook 1 or 2 pastry balls at a time, turning them frequently with 2 spatulas. Remove when cooked. Coat with honey. Sprinkle with poppy seeds, and so serve. So I made these with spelt flour and grated cheese, just cheddar though. So it might make more sense to make it with something like feta, which would be closer to what the Romans had. And then fried them, and they were so nice, even just at that stage.
Really?
I do like melted cheese myself. It's very good.
Yeah.
And then I heated up some honey and transferred them and kind of coated them in that warm honey, and then rolled them in poppy seeds, and they went down very well in my household. So obviously, when you're talking about Roman cooking, often a lot of people think of Apicius, who there is a cookbook attributed to him, but that's probably a collection of recipes from all over the place. But that you do find recipes here and there in other books as well. So Cato's on agriculture, and you've got Columella as well wrote another book on agriculture, and included some recipes. My favourite one is Athenaeus, who was indeed a Greek but living under the Roman Empire, who wrote a book called The Partying Professors, and had quite a few nice recipes in that about what to do when you're having a party. Itrion is a nice one, which is where you make a biscuit with sesame seeds and honey, and it's like sesame snaps, which you can buy today. It's just like that. They're really nice.
And more on that a bit later, perhaps, as well, when we're finishing off. So yeah, keep watching, everyone. Let's quickly move on now, because we're going up to the higher end of society, so to speak. This is a triclinium from Pompeii, and this is really, we've gone to the other extreme now. This is really posh dining, isn't it? It's posh nosh. Andrew, you took this photograph again. It's Pompeii.
Yeah, so this is a wonderful house. I should add that this was taken many years ago. I think they've actually restored the house because it wasn't in very good condition when I was there. But it does show the triclinium, and of course the triclinium would have been one of the most important rooms in a Roman house. It was where you were going to be doing your entertaining, and it was the room that you wanted to impress with. So here you might just be able to make out that instead of a mosaic floor, we've got a floor in front of the benches which is made of cut pieces of marble, so an opus sectile floor. And for the Romans, that was one up of mosaic. Having a mosaic in your house, it meant that you had an important house, but having a cut stone floor was the best. That was, yeah, that's what the emperors had. So here we have this wonderful opus sectile floor, which, yeah, does look rather dusty. But what's really interesting, you might be able to see on 2 sides around the floor. Originally, it would have been on 3 sides. We have the remains of the couches that the Romans would have used to recline on when they were eating their food. So wooden couches, and it was quite interesting because I was reading about these. I've always sort of presumed that each couch would be for one person, but apparently the couches were large enough, and actually looking at this picture, they do look quite large, that you possibly could have had up to 3 people on each couch, and they would have gone around the outside of the room, and that's where you would have reclined, discussed Roman politics, and eaten your Roman meals. So a nice example of how the room would have been set out here in this picture from Pompeii. Mm-hmm. And I think we've also got a reconstruction.
Yes, the Domus de Lulubriga in Spain, northern Spain.
Lulubriga, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks to him, yeah.
Yeah, so this shows a little bit what Andrew was saying. You'd have either the stone floor or the mosaic floor in the centre, and then with the couches around the outside where you recline. Not a very safe way to eat your foods, as we now know, but the Romans loved it. And there's a table. It's got lovely pottery and glassware and metalware on there as well, as you can see, where some fruit is being served. Yeah, this Domus de Lullobriga is near Santander in Cantabria in northern Spain, and they recreated some of the rooms from a big villa that was there, but it was also just outside a Roman town as well. So bit smaller than Londinium,
Yes, yeah.
but they're still, and up in the mountains as well. It was a lovely place, but still sharing quite a lot of the same culture because of they were part of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, and just getting back, I believe we're getting back to Londinium. We have been off around the empire. Mosaics have been found across the city over the past 200 years or so. There are many images. I found many images in researching the exhibition a few years ago of all sorts of images, sorts of imagery of Roman imagery, such as Bacchus and animals and so on. But this is probably the most famous, the Bucklesbury mosaic. This is a 19th century report on it. It folds out, the image of it is folded out. You can still see the folds in there. I didn't want to press it because it's a delicate piece of paper, but you can see the original in the Museum of London. But yeah, so this is definitely London. This is definitely Londinium, and it's the kind of mosaic you'd find in a triclinium. Andrew.
And if it's a wonderful print, but if we could see the whole of the mosaic that was uncovered here, they've just depicted the central section, so the nice bit with the pattern, but around the outside, and we can just see the start of it there was a thick border of plain red tesserae, and that's where the couches would have been positioned. So we've seen sort of the luxury model in Pompeii, but yeah, they're doing a similar sort of thing in Roman London.
Yeah, and just to say, I did go to the Museum of London and try to take a photograph of this. It's set out with the room around it, but I couldn't because it's so big. I couldn't. My camera wasn't. I couldn't stand back far enough. My camera wasn't at a wide angle enough to get it all in one shot. So it's a huge mosaic. It really is quite substantial. But let's crack on. There is, of course, a banquet scene, a mosaic of a banquet scene to give you an idea of it. Andrew, Kim, did you want to say anything else about this before we go on to back to London and Billingsgate?
So yeah, we've just got some Romans actually reclining on the seats here, and I thought it was quite interesting. I was trying to think about it a minute ago, but I know as part of my background reading, I was reading about the pros and cons of reclining when you're eating your food, and apparently it's much better to recline either to the left or to the right because of the way of the organs internally if you want to actually consume your food. So the Romans always would have reclined either to the left or to the right when they were eating. It made it easier to digest your food.
Brilliant.
I think some early childhood specialists would take issue with how safe that is, because we're always told that children should sit up straight,
Yes.
Otherwise there's chance of choking. But there you go.
But I think as well it's quite interesting because this possibility of being able to recline is a wealthy thing, and of course it's the wealthy that have got the space. They've got the big villas, they've got large rooms to be able to put the couches around the outside to be able to recline. And of course, for most Roman Londoners, I mean, they're probably living in quite small quarters. So they would have had to have sat upright because, they didn't have the space to recline in a similar way to the elite Romans. And I would just mention this is a particularly interesting mosaic because it shows what would have been the competitors at the games on the night before the games, reclining and having a big banquet. So I think in this case, they're not gladiators, but they would have been competitors who would have been fighting wild animals. So that's what we have here. They're enjoying their last meal.
Yes, they are. They'll be going into the arena with a hangover, perhaps. Lots of rich food and too much wine. Yes. Right. Let's get back to London again, because Billingsgate. We always talk about Billingsgate. Oh, I'm sorry. No. I've got an image of a triclinium. Completely forgot. Not in my notes. In Pompeii, and this is an external one, outside one, isn't it? But you can see the U-shape arrangement, that platform where the benches would have gone. And a bit of wall decoration as well. I mean, Andrew, did you want to add anything else before we
No,
get back to...
it's just, if you're incredibly elite in the Roman world, then, and possibly more in Mediterranean climates than in London, you might also have not just the triclinium for most of your meals, you might have a summer triclinium for those particularly hot evenings, built into your villa. And yet we have a nice example here of a summer triclinium from Pompeii, and just very nicely decorated. So some nice wall decoration here. And of course, we know that lots of the large villas in London would have been decorated with frescoes on the walls. So in a similar type of fashion.
Yeah, great, thank you. And yes, but we are going to head back to Billingsgate now, finish up in Billingsgate. We always talk about Billingsgate Roman house and baths, and we always focus on the bathhouse because that's the most impressive structure that's left, and we see. But it was a house. It was, we think, a U-shaped house, a house that was made of ragstone. So it was limestone, as well as the bricks. It was a very expensive house. It had its own courtyard, we believe, that looked over the River Thames. So we can imagine this time of year, June, July, summertime. Perhaps they are opening their doors with their triclinium, looking out across the water, enjoying their food. But again, going back to the small finds, what sort of evidence do we have actually for this, Kim?
Yeah, so there are reports from the early excavations of Samian ware, flagons, amphorae, and things like that. And I just wanted to share what I think is the most exciting find. This one is not actually from Billingsgate. This is from Winthill in Somerset, but it is this the kind of cup that we think would have been at Billingsgate. So it's beautiful glass, completely transparent, which is really quite special in the Roman world. And you can see that there's a pattern etched on the outside of it. So this one shows a hunting scene, I think. But if you go forward, and we'll see the broken fragments of a glass like this from Billingsgate. So this is all we have of the glass from Billingsgate, but it's, as you can see, very special. It's this see-through and etched glass, although this has got, instead of figurative stuff, it's got abstract patterns on it. But glass like this, it's difficult to quite say what date it is, but you're getting really high quality transparent etched glass in the later Roman period. So it may be from the 4th century, and a lot of it was made in Cologne in Germany, which supplied the really high status glass to a lot of areas of the Western Empire. And other glass vessels, like some of the ones we saw earlier, the blue and the green ones, and thicker and non-decorated ones, would definitely be made in London, but some of the high status ones might still have been imported.
So we've got, sorry, go on.
No, carry on.
No, I was just wrapping up, really. Did you want to add anything else?
Just that the last image is of a globular amphora, I think.
Oh, yes.
And this isn't actually quite the right style. This is from Lyon Museum, when I took this a couple of years ago. So amphorae go all the way through the Roman Empire, and as you saw right at the beginning, even the pre-Roman Iron Age kings in Britain wanted to be like the Romans, and they loved wine, and they imported wine in these amphorae. And after the Roman legions left as well, London was still importing wine, and there was an amphora like this, a very globular shape, from Gaza, that was imported to Billingsgate Roman house and baths. And unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the actual one. But it just goes to show that wine was really a really important import, and one that everybody loved from before even the Romans turned up, and then even after they left, wine was still coming into Britain.
Brilliant. Yes, and our bathhouse, our domestic house and bathhouse within the centre of it, we think very much a place for higher end. We'd like to think anyway, higher end entertainment, dining, food, wine, and so on. This has really been a quick, even though we feel like we've been talking a long while, it has been a quick sort of romp through the food and wine of Roman London. There's plenty more we could talk about. We haven't really talked about garum, the fish sauce. We haven't, we mentioned dormice. We haven't talked about other things. Kim's just remembered something. Did you want to talk about it now, Kim, while we're here?
No, that's fine.
No?
But yes, I mean, if you go to the next one, the next slide, we
yes.
Yeah, we have got.
Yes.
We've produced a Roman party pack. Andrew and I and some of our colleagues in the City of London produced this party pack, and it does have a few different recipes in there from different Roman writers, and one of them includes garum. You can buy a type of garum now, and we call it Thai fish sauce, and it's quite similar, although there were different types of garum. And there is one recipe in this is a dipping sauce for bread with oil and garum, and my daughter, it stinks, this garum stuff. The fish sauce really it stinks really bad, but when you eat it, it tastes yummy. My daughter absolutely loved it, and I'd like to just put in a word of recommendation for the cucumeries. I made those again yesterday because I love them so much. They're pickled cucumbers. You hot pickle them with a bit of honey, and they're just delicious.
Yeah, and there's the Itrion, the sesame biscuits you were talking about as well. They're sesame seeds and honey. They're there too. Right. Could you have those with the garum? Dip them in the garum?
Oh no, I don't think that would work. No.
Oh, okay.
That's for pudding.
And where can you? Oh, yeah, of course, I see. And where can you get the party pack from? Is it available on our City Together website?
That's right, yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so look up Our City Together. There you'll get lots of activities, but including the food. So do go and try some of these things. That kind of finishes it up for us. If you have any questions for us, please drop us a line. There's our website, Twitter, and the Facebook as well. We have an email, which you can find on our website page too. But thank you very much for watching us. We've all been working from home, so we're not together in one office. We're in our little homes across the southeast and London. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining us. And yeah, keep an eye out for our next videos that are coming soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.